Great. Okay, so Sophie, have you got the presentation?
Yeah, just it should be recording.
Perfect. So if you could move on to the next slide. Lovely. Great. Eva, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for joining, and thank you very much, Martha and Darren and Sophie, for making this possible. I'm just going to give you a really quick context of, I give you the context of the audience analysis, although most of you are already familiar with it. As you know, as part of the Tax Justice Together project, we committed ourselves to undertake audience analysis, at least one in each one of the countries that are involved in the project. And the reason to do that is so that the different partners have enough information about their audience so that they can inform their national campaigns, so that you can actually fine-tune your campaign based on what you know about your audience, what they are more responsive to, or the kind of topics they're more keen on, or on taking action on, and so on. So this should definitely help achieve the outcomes expected from project, but at the same time, it should, in the longer term, it should serve to strengthen all of our skills in doing audience analysis. And we know that, unfortunately, because of lack of funds sometimes, or time, or experience, we don't use audience analysis as often as we should. So ideally, this exercise should help us build the capacity and to do this as a regular practice for our campaigns. And then finally, it'd be a really good tool to create and share information about different audiences across Europe. You know that the aim of this project, or what the project relies a lot on, is in this global movement for tax justice, not only in Europe, but especially in Europe. So it's definitely a really good input for our global movement to have such details and such country specificities on audiences.
Great. Thank you, Eva.
Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. So, as this is about audience analysis, we thought it would be useful to just start with a quick overview of what audience analysis is and how it's different from polling. So, normally our audience analysis comes certainly before polling and normally before the start of any kind of activities or campaigns you're doing. And really, the idea is to find out who's your audience, what do they think, what do they think, and how best to talk to them. Or usually one or two of those kind of questions. Polling is much more, you already know what you're doing, you've already perhaps done some activities, and really it's finding out whether it's worked or not, or what kind of impact you've had. So that's the main distinction between the two. So audience analysis, you're really looking for an in-depth, or as much depth as possible, about the audience that you're interested in. So you might already know or have a good idea of who you want to talk to. So, for example, if most of your campaign activity is going to be online and you're looking to influence the views of younger people, it makes sense to do your audience analysis and find out more about, say, internet users under 30. It may be, though, that it works the other way. So you might have an idea of what you want to do. Say your main activity is going to be a petition around tax justice, and you want to find who is going to be most likely to take a petition around tax justice, that kind of issues. So audience analysis either is finding out more about an audience that you already know, or you can also build in, okay, who's my audience to start with. Polling is going to be much more specific, so it's going to be much more tied towards a few questions or a few points that you're looking to measure over time, and that's really going to be the main things that you're looking to influence. So, for example, if you're looking to influence views around tax justice or inequality, you might have 5, 6, or 7 questions that you ask, say, every 6 months, or every year, or every 3 months, whatever's appropriate, to find out if what you're doing is influencing those views. In terms of audience, so in audience analysis, it can be quite open in terms of who you're going to be researching with. With polling, who the research audience is should really strongly reflect who you've been targeting with most of your activities. So again, if most of your campaign activities are with younger people online, it doesn't make much sense and it's not very efficient to have a nationally representative sample. So it's important to match who you're polling and who you're tracking with who most of your activities are towards. So hopefully that gives you just a very brief overview of what audience analysis is. Mark is going to talk a bit more now about the kinds of questions, the kinds of ways you can use audience analysis.
Great, thank you. So, in terms of the ways in which you can use audience research, it really depends on where you are in the kind of the work that you're doing. So, for example, you could be right at the beginning of the process and you don't really know who's the best person or type of person to target. So, for example, it could be people who say they are concerned about tax justice, or it could be a bit wider. It could be people who previously campaigned on certain issues, or wider again. So it could be internet users under 30, as Darren mentioned. So a type of audience research then you can use there is to understand, how big that group might be. So, for example, it could be that people who are concerned about tax justice is just too small a group to target, and so then you have to go broader. If you're a little bit further on in your work, you could be thinking, well, I know who I want to talk to, but I don't really know how to talk to them. So, for example, audience research can be used to identify a range of things, such as demographics, so understanding if your group are any particular age, are they likely to be more male than female, or vice versa? Are there certain regions of your country where you're more likely to find them? Certain behaviours, so do they give to charity, for example? Are they already engaged? Do they already campaign on certain social issues? And then even wider, just to their general lifestyle, do they consume certain types of media? So are they reading certain newspapers or certain magazines? Are they on certain social media channels? And the whole idea there is really helping you to kind of structure your campaign effectively. So you're not buying media, for example, that this group don't read. Or you're not targeting people in a certain area of the country where this group aren't really living. So it helps you be kind of really efficient with what you're doing. And then finally, another way is about if you're a bit further on in your challenge, so you know who you're talking to, you think you have a good idea of the kind of person that they are and how you talk to them. You might have gone to a creative agency, for example, and come up with some concepts. So it might be concepts for a TV advert or a print ad or a social media post or that kind of thing. And so you might want to test how well certain concepts will resonate with your target audience. So what you can, there's a variety of ways you can do that. So things like focus groups you might have heard of, where you just get a load of people from your target audience in a room and present your concepts to them. You can also do that kind of research online, but it will give you a good idea of, if there are particular concepts that work and those that don't. Sometimes some concepts will be completely rejected. If, for example, you've done a previous campaign that worked really well, you can use that as a benchmark. So you could use this type of research to test whether or not these concepts perform as well as your benchmark. And you can also look at optimizing concepts. So if you have a concept that's kind of broadly successful with your group, you might be able to identify if there's certain phrases, certain languages, or certain images that that do or don't work. So you can take pieces from multiple concepts to create kind of the best one that's going to work the most efficiently. So I'm going to hand back to Darren to start talking about how you would approach audience research.
Great. So the process is, it's relatively straightforward. The vast majority of research is done through an agency, and the steps you go through, a lot of it is just the same as commissioning any other agency to do something. So you start with your objectives. That would form core part of a brief. Then you normally approach a number of agencies who will then write a proposal in response to your brief. You'd select your agency, You'll already have agreed as part of your brief what you'd like the output to be, so whether that's a presentation, a written report, or so on. And then a really important step at the end that is unique to research is turning the findings of the research into something really useful and actionable. So actually, the research itself is often the easy part. It's the other two things is finding the objectives and turning them into action. That's actually quite hard. If research fails, it's normally at one of these 2 points, because either the objectives weren't specific enough or weren't clearly enough stated, so the agency has gone off and answered a question that really doesn't hit what you're trying to do and isn't that kind of that obvious, or there are way too many research projects that just kind of sit in people's drawers, or people will go to debrief presentations and go, oh, that's really interesting, but it won't actually turn into any action, or nothing different will happen as a result. So really, at least as much energy needs to be put into understanding and planning how the research, the results of the research, are going to be communicated internally, and how that's going to turn into action, because that's often the tricky part. So in terms of setting the objectives, if we can go on to the next slide. Apologies for anyone who hates acronyms, but this is a slightly useful acronym that really states the points that you might, or the kind of questions that you might want to be considering when you're writing your brief to the agency. So it's PCOP, but spelled wrong. So the first one is population. So who are you interested in targeting? As I said, you might not know, first of all, if there's a specific population, but you should have an idea of who you want to be covering in the research. So that might, if you don't know what your specific population is, you might start with a broad kind of spectrum and say it's a nationally representative sample that you're interested in. But first of all, you have to make that decision. The intervention is what you're doing, and is really obvious. So, if you're planning for a campaign, it's going to be very different research from if there's a fundraising activity, and obviously spelling that out is going to be a really critical part of the brief. The comparison is optional, so you don't always have something that you want to compare against, but often you do. So, as Martha said, it might be comparing against something that you worked in the past, so to kind of gauge how well your kind of current activities are likely to work. It might be that you've got a number of concepts and you want to compare one against the other and see which one works best. Or it might be that you're interested in views on tax justice for young people versus older people to kind of decide who you're going to focus on. So at least considering who and what comparisons that you might make can be really useful. And the outcome is what you're trying to achieve in the project more generally. So that might be to get people to sign a petition around tax, in which case you obviously want to be including intention to sign petitions. It might be perceptions of inequality, so you'll obviously have to include then people's attitudes to inequality. So this should really be a list that's as detailed as possible about what are the kinds of things that you're looking to influence. And then finally, context. So often there are things going on that might affect the research findings, and sometimes in ways that you don't want. So, for example, if there's a high-profile media campaign going on at the moment on the same subject that you're researching about, that's likely to influence what people are saying in the research. So you need to really bear that in mind. And it might be that you move the research, or you build in some other kind of ways of mitigating that. So that's just a kind of an overview of some of the questions you might want to consider. It's really important, obviously, to talk to all your key stakeholders. Again, it can be quite common that different people have different objectives from the research, and if that's not ironed out beforehand, you can get into problems. And you have to really prioritise. So there's only a limited amount of what can be achieved in the research, so it's important to be realistic and kind of prioritise about what you want to include. Okay.
Great. So, so the next step in the process is to write your brief. So Darren's given you the tools there with the PCOC acronym for kind of setting your objectives, and that will form probably the biggest part of your brief. But when you're approaching this, it's really important that you have kind of some key components in there. So The first one is obviously some context. So if you're approaching research agencies that you've never used before, you need to give them some background about your organisation as well as the project and just generally the context of the research so that they can really understand where it's coming from, because sometimes you can say that you have a certain set of objectives, but if an agency knows your organisation well enough and knows the project, they will be better able to challenge you and say, well, actually you could look at it in a different way and it might provide a better outcome. So then you would put in your objectives, so giving a kind of summary of your peacock. Really what's important here is what you want to achieve, but also how you'll use the research. So, don't just go in saying, I have this question, I want it answered. It's helpful for the agency to know how you're going to use the research. So again, they can give you the best possible options. And then also how you want it delivered. So whether or not you want a PowerPoint presentation or a written report or things like that. If you know that already, it's great to put that in there. Again, talking about audience, so if you know who you're targeting, put that in there as well, or just put you want a broad NatRep sample. Is there anything that you already know about them? So if you already know who they are, have you done previous research? Are there particular findings that, again, would give context to the research? Then there's the kind of admin-y type stuff, so the timeline. It's really important to be realistic here. So Darren and I will both have had experience of projects where, people want research tomorrow, and that's not really possible. So just be completely realistic when you're giving them a deadline. A good piece of research can take kind of between 4 and 8 weeks, depending on the kind of methodology that you're using. And the agency will give you guidance on that, but it's good to give them an idea of the kind of deadline that you're working to. And then finally, the budget. So this is optional to include, but quite often an agency will ask what your budget is so that they don't come in with something that's wildly expensive that you're never going to be able to afford. And also so that they're not trying to scrimp on the quality to be too cheap. So just give them an idea if you have one. And so some kind of things to remember, it's really important to be concise as well. So no more than kind of 2 to 3 pages. You don't want to give them a big essay to read. And stakeholder management comes back in here as well. So consult key people on the brief and circulate the final version, but do keep it to kind of a small group so that you're not getting too many people inputting. And remember, just with the whole of the brief, just remember that you're really trying to help your agency get to know you as an organisation, your project, and what you're trying to do so that they can help you in the best way. So when it comes to choosing an agency, best practice is usually to consult kind of 2 to 3 agencies. It might be that you have a procurement practice that means you have to have 3, for example, so always check that out. If you need to find some good agencies, there's an organisation called ESOMAR. So they're kind of a European organisation which can give you guidance on agencies that are accredited with various national organisations. So that's always a good place to start. It's also really important to brief multiple agencies because then you'll get a good idea of costs and the kinds of methodologies that can be used to answer this question. When you've sent them your brief, start with a phone call or a face-to-face meeting, just as you would with any supplier. And then these agencies should come back with a proposal, and the kinds of things you should be looking for in these proposals are, really clear summary of how they want to answer your objectives. So, a lot of proposals will repeat your objectives back to you and tell you how they're going to answer them. There should be a clear idea of how much it will cost and how long it will take. And it should also give you an idea of who will be working on the project. So usually kind of a key team members with maybe a little biography of what they've done before and what experience they have. So if they've worked with other charities, for example, or other organisations like this, they should put a little bit in there so that you can have faith that they've done this kind of thing before. So then when you've got your proposals and you're trying to choose your agency, obviously the first thing to look at is the cost. So how do the costs compare to each other? Are there any that are a lot more expensive or a lot cheaper? But don't do it just based on cost. Do they have relevant experience with similar projects or similar clients? And most importantly, I think, do you understand what they're proposing? So if they're the kind of agency who've come back with something that's very technical and they're talking a lot about methodologies and statistics, and if you don't understand that, then that's going to be a problem, because ultimately these are the people who have to communicate the insight to your stakeholders, and quite often your stakeholders will have even less experience with research. So if you can't understand what they're saying, then your stakeholders won't understand what they're saying. So, and likewise, do you feel like you're going to work well together? Do you feel like you can trust them, and is this going to be a collaborative partnership where you can both challenge each other in a positive way? Because that's really important with this kind of project. So if you find that you have an agency where the cost may be slightly higher than some of the others, but you think that they're really the right ones for you, don't be afraid to negotiate, because agencies will expect that. Costs tend to be quite flexible. Okay, so once you've found your agency and they've done the research for you, it gets to the debrief stage. So first off, it's really important to agree the method of delivery when you commission the research. So as I said in the brief, talk about whether or not you want a face-to-face presentation or a report or something like that. We tend to find that face-to-face presentations are the ideal situation, again, because the agency will be the experts. So you can get all your stakeholders in a room, and then they're going to be the best person to answer the questions. But if you feel confident, the agency can send you a deck or a report, and you can obviously run a debrief with your stakeholders separately. But agree that up front. Book the date early in the process. So this is common with all kinds of projects. Senior stakeholders can always be really difficult to get in the same place at the same time. So if you're putting a debrief in the timeline with your agency, try and get that booked as early as possible so that you don't have to end up moving it. What we always try to do is build a couple of days into the timeline to review the deck, so where the agency will send it to you as the project manager, so you can read it through and suggest if there are anything that need amending. So it could be that something's a little bit confusing or a little bit technical or something like that, to give you a bit of space just to have that discussion with the agency before it gets put in front of your stakeholders. And then when it comes to the time of the actual debrief, it's a really good idea to start discussing actions and trying to kind of think about drafting action plans when you're in the session with the agency, because it means that the agency can also give opinions where appropriate on the kinds of actions that you're looking at for your project. And also make sure that you record any feedback or questions that weren't answered in the session, and then you can follow up with the agency afterwards and they can come back to you with some answers to any of your questions. It's really important with a debrief to make sure that you've kind of talked to your stakeholders before the meeting, because a debrief shouldn't just be a lecture. It should be an active kind of discussion between the agency, between you and your stakeholders. So you need your stakeholders to be engaged, not to be just kind of sitting there expecting to be talked at. Okay, so then the final stage of the process, as Darren mentioned, is making sure that you turn the insight into action, because that's where research can really demonstrate its worth. So once you've done the debrief, follow up quickly, both with the stakeholders and the agency, because often, if you've had a good debrief, your stakeholders will come out feeling quite energized and quite excited about what they've seen. So capitalize on that, use that, and try and follow up quickly. It's always a good idea to generate a summary document. So take some key slides from the deck that the agency had provided to kind of create a story or a narrative around your original question, and then add in any of the extra insight or actions that were discussed at the end of the debrief. It's always a great idea as well to facilitate a workshop with your key stakeholders to really talk about what the research results mean. So you might have touched on that in the debrief, as I suggested. Even if you have, it's always good to have a follow-up anyway, so that people have had a bit of time to digest the research and digest the discussion, and then you can run a separate workshop to understand the implications and how you're going to progress your campaign as a result. And then end with an action plan. So draft an action plan. As with any project, make sure your objectives are smart and use the insight to really inform what you're going to be doing. Okay, and on to Darren.
Great, so that was a brief overview of the process and the kind of things that audience analysis can be used for. We just thought it would be useful to make this a little more concrete and to give you a bit better idea of the types of ways that audience analysis can be used, just by giving you a quick case study now at the end. So I'm going to very briefly talk about a project that we did as Oxfam GB a couple of years ago that was looking at how we communicate poverty in the UK to a UK audience. So the background is that we are very well known for our work on global poverty overseas, but far fewer people know that we also work on poverty in the UK. So we thought there would be some advantages of communicating about UK poverty, one for our influencing work, but also in getting more support, so for fundraising and so on. So we wanted to find out really what are going to be the opportunities and the risks around communicating UK poverty, particularly the risks because we knew, or we thought, that domestic poverty was going to be much more political and therefore much more of a risk of putting off some supporters than poverty overseas. And we also wanted to test some communications ideas that we had, so some kind of messages to make sure that we were communicating in the most effective way. So we found it quite a standard process that we've already been through. So we developed a brief on the back of our objectives, and we approached 3 agencies. We selected one agency called Flamingo that we'd worked with quite a bit in the past. They knew us really well, and their proposal was really the most developed and the most detailed, and also the most cost-effective as well. So it kind of makes sense that we went with them. So they did 5 focus groups and 6 interviews. It took around a month to do the project as a whole. And we made sure that we had a mixture of Oxfam supporters and other supporters to make sure we had a comparison between the two and seeing, you know, were we going to turn off some Oxfam supporters but attract other supporters and so on. And then obviously we arranged a debrief session where the agency came in and presented key stakeholders. We followed that up with a workshop to really implement you know, how this was going to turn into action. So just as a quick example of the kind of things that we found out and the kinds of things that audience analysis might be useful for. So one of the main things we found out was that actually we couldn't use the word poverty when we were talking about UK poverty, which was quite a surprise and obviously something really important for the campaign. But people had very different views over what they called third world poverty, and which they saw in quite a one-dimensional way of kind of passive victims who were kind of helpless but very much innocent and therefore worthy of support and help, over UK poverty where it was much more complex, people's ideas were much more developed, and it was much more controversial for that reason. People had different typologies, you know, of who was poor and who was deserving and so on. And when we mentioned the word poverty, people thought of this kind of, you know, what they call third world poverty on the left, and tried to map that onto the UK poverty, and it didn't make sense to people at all. They started going, well, there's no poverty in the UK, which obviously, discovering that earlier on, before we started developing loads of comms that mentioned the word poverty, was really, really important. Then we also, so as I said, going on to the next slide, one of the main things that we were interested in was what were going to be the kind of risks about, not just talking about UK poverty, but Oxfam talking about UK poverty. And we found that actually there weren't really that many risks, and it seemed a really natural fit for people, for us, as a British charity, as Oxfam GB, to be talking about domestic poverty in Britain. It kind of, you know, people said it felt like Oxfam coming home. So actually what we thought was going to be a risk, as it turned out, really wasn't. And then finally, going on to the next slide, just as some examples of, we gave the agencies some text and messages that we were looking to test. They showed it to the people in the focus groups and the interviews, and they came back to us saying, you know, what parts of those messages were likely to work and what really wasn't. So what we found out, for example, is that talking about people in work but still suffering from poverty was going to be really effective at challenging some people's views around people who are in poverty simply because they're lazy and therefore they don't deserve help. So in-work poverty, we realised, was going to be really fundamental. Talking about the proximity, so poverty is closer than you think in the UK, really made it relevant for people, and people could then identify with people in poverty, which made a big difference to people really getting on board with the campaign. We either found on the kind of the flip side that this was during the recession, and we thought the recession was going to be a really important part of this. Actually, we found that communicating that really didn't help. People just accepted the fact that it was a recession and there was nothing they could do about it, and that led a lot of people to kind of reject the messaging. So this is just a kind of a selection of some of the things that we got back, but hopefully gives you a taste of the kind of ways that you can use audience analysis and the kind of things that you can get out of it and some of the value of it. So that's, as I say, that's a quick overview of the process and some examples. And what will be great now is we've got some time, so if you have any specific questions around anything that we've presented, but also audience analysis more widely and the kinds of ways that you could use it, then please do ask.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Right?
Hi, it's Daria. I actually have a question on, all right, let's say that it's about the target group, so from the beginning. Let's say that I would like to target the small and medium enterprises, yes, for the campaign of how to create a message to get them on our side. And I actually don't know too much about them. So before I go, is it better to make a research on my own, or just simply like, can it be taken to the agency saying, we want to know in general what message do we have to go with to small and medium enterprises in general? Which do you think is better?
So I would say that you could go to an agency with that, because they could get. So wait, sorry. When you say small and medium enterprises, do you mean like the business owners?
Yes, actually. Okay, because we have never done it in Poland. So I think the owners, the people who are actually have some ability to, or how to say it, have some something to say in the local community and so on. So they can together they can make a voice or support our objectives in the like higher group. Let's say that they are members of the federations for small and medium enterprises in Poland, which are these kind of federations. There are a few of them. So but we want to target these SMEs, and here actually I don't know who they want to go after.
Yeah, so I think it sounds like you have a good idea really of who you want to target. So it's then more, I guess, about how you talk to them. So you could go to an agency with that, and you could say that you wanted to target small and medium enterprises, and they could recruit people within those businesses, as you say, who have the ability to make a change. So whether it's the owners, whether it's directors, etc., they could recruit based on that and get a sample together that you could then test either different messages, like different message concepts, or even just to find out a bit more about them in terms of their attitudes to tax and their willingness to help. Darren, I don't know if you have anything else.
Because what I'm afraid here is, isn't this going too close to the polling aims? It's because maybe I could easily order polling to this group and say, okay, do you agree with blah blah blah,
So you could use polling, exactly, because you could ask kind of a relatively focused set of questions about whether they agree with certain attitudes. I guess if you're wanting to develop a message of some kind that's going to convince them to participate and support you, then you might need a different methodology from polling, because it might be that you want something a little bit like a focus group
Okay.
or a more detailed survey where you can give some ideas of kinds of messages you might have, the kinds of ideas, you know, that sort of thing. So, yeah, Darren, I'm going to pass that to you again.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think because small business owners are quite a specialist audience, there are specialised agencies that kind of will deal with this sorts of research. So it wouldn't necessarily be your traditional research agencies. There are kind of business-to-business research agencies and that sort of thing who may be, may have that much more experience with small business owners and this kind of audience. One thing that to bear in mind, the more specific your audience becomes, generally the more expensive it is to research with them. So it may be worth obviously finding out how much it's likely to cost up front.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions from anyone else?
One more. Can I have one more?
Yeah, of course.
Actually, I think I don't understand exactly what the insight is. I mean, in your which slide was it? Yeah, turn insight into action. So how does it work? Is it in Oxfam already, right? Or is it in the agency? I'm confused here.
Sorry, so do you mean just kind of the actual term, insight, and how we use it?
I mean, who's doing it? And more like, who's doing it and how did you manage to do it? Is it correlated with the 15? With the slide number 15?
Oh, yeah. Let me unmute the presentation back.
Yes, so no, I mean, insight's one of those words that, there's not a really clear definition. I mean, one of my colleagues kind of calls it an aha moment where things suddenly become clear and kind of make sense. So often you get a lot of output from the research, but not all of it is going to be, kind of key. I think the insight part of it is, when things suddenly kind of make sense and clear, and you get a really kind of clear direction. So it's quite muddy, but that's kind of when we talk about turning research into insight. It's very much about making it useful and making it really intuitive and make sense to people. So, for example, on this project that I went through, we did the debrief and then we did a workshop with key stakeholders, which really just tried to cement the research in their mind and come up with kind of a clear action plan. I don't know if that makes things any clearer. I don't know, Marta,
Yeah, no, because I wanted to know if actually here in the insight, if the agency takes any part, or you just did it internally in Oxfam, and you said, okay, so we're going to do this and this and that.
Yeah, I think. I think a good agency will give you insight as part of the debrief. So, a bad debrief. A collection of statistics that don't necessarily mean anything. The insight is tying it all together and saying this is really what this means, and then making recommendations off the back of it. So a good agency will at least start to give you some kind of recommendations, and obviously they don't have as much background to your business as you do, so they'll make suggestions which you can then obviously decide if they're sensible or not, and then it's turning that knowledge into an actual action plan. So saying, well, this is what I know now, and this is what I can do as a result of it. That is then the internal piece.
Okay.
It has to be in collaboration with your key stakeholders.
Yeah.
They have to be part of that process. There's no good saying, look, these are the things that you have to do. To really get it embedded in the organisation, it has to be a kind of a co-creation, if you like.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Now I got it.
Lovely. Are there any other questions?
Hi, this is Lison. Can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Hello, hi. Thanks for the presentation. I have a question. When you speak about your key stakeholder,
Yeah.
would you precise who it might be for you internally?
So, okay, that's a great question. Well, it will obviously vary from each project, depending on what you're trying to do. So, as an example, with pieces of research that I've done before. Oh, are we all still good? Is everyone still there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, good. Don't know what that was. Anyway, yeah, so previous projects that I've worked on, your key stakeholders may be, so if it was a fundraising project, for example, your key stakeholders may be the, senior people in fundraising, the director of fundraising, for example. If you're doing a piece of research that's specific to a piece of communication, so if it was a communication to try and attract new people in, your stakeholders would be the people who are in support of acquisition or things like that. So it really does just depend on your project. So I guess with the tax project, it would be potentially senior people within your campaigns department. So it could be your head of campaigns, it could be a head of advocacy. I don't know. So I guess what's really important is back to Dario's question, when you're turning insight into action, you need to know who the key people are who are going to make that action possible. So who are the people that you're working with who will be the ones making stuff happen, basically. And those are your key stakeholders, really. Those are the people that you need to inform.
Well, one thing we found useful is if it's a major project, to identify, a really senior person who sponsors it, basically,
Yeah.
who is going to really kind of push it through, and they're normally right at the top, so they've got the authority to make sure that that it's actually delivered. What the action plan as a result of it is actually delivered.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. I have another question. Which moment of a project would you do an audience analysis? Because for us, we are already a bit advanced, and maybe I was thinking it's already a little late, but maybe not. Maybe I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think it really just depends. Is there anything left that you can still influence in your project? So, as we were talking about, research is only useful if it's actually going to influence something and if you can turn it into action. So if you're so far advanced that there's kind of nothing left for you to do other than wait and see, if anything changes, you could, in theory, do some research afterwards to see if things have changed. Yeah, it depends. But it really just depends how advanced are you. I mean, is there anything left for you to do on the project? Or are you kind of partway through, or...?
No, there is plenty to do, but I was thinking it was maybe before beginning a campaign, more than during a campaign. But I'm sure for us we will find plenty to do with an audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is preferable to do it early on, so that if you're trying to find out more about your audience, etc., before you start booking media or things like that, absolutely, it's better to do it early on. But it could be that you might want to start using a different channel. For example, you might have already started your campaign, but you might not have done anything on social media. So you could do some research if it was appropriate to see what works on social media or what social media channels your audience uses. Or things like that. So you can still do research in the middle of a project, but obviously it's for you to decide if you think that it's going to be able to influence an action. Otherwise, it's not really worth it.
Okay, thanks. And another question: can our audience be like just generally our supporters, or do we have to be really precise?
Yeah, absolutely. It can be your supporters. So that's actually that's a great audience to use because you have a good idea of how to get in touch with them. So you can research them quite easily. Yeah, they're absolutely fine. I think if you have a massive supporter database, it depends on the size of the base. You can absolutely still use them, but obviously you'd need your agency to make sure you had a representative sample. So, if you had a wide variety of ages in your supporter or a wide variety of where they live, you'd need to make sure that your sample was representative of all of those kind of different variations. If you've got a smaller database, that tends to be less of an issue, but your agency could help you with that.
Okay, thanks.
I have a couple of questions, if possible.
Cool.
I don't know if you can hear me because I. Yeah. Okay, perfect. This is Misha from Oxfam, Italy. Thanks, first of all, for the presentation. Very, very clear. I have two questions. The first one is when you approach an agency and the agency tells you and describes you in detail the methodology they would like to go through, should they also give you insights of the way they are, of the sampling procedures they are carrying on? I make you an easy example. How do you feel, Mark and Darren, about, for instance, an agency who tells you that they would use a sort of entrusted database of people they generally interview, and for whom they, in order to keep them in this database, they may even provide some commercial incentives, some bonuses, or eventually even pay them. How do you feel about this kind of methodology and samples?
Yeah, Darren, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, they should definitely spell out how they're going to sample it. I mean, it doesn't always necessarily have to be kind of done statistically or kind of nationally representative. Certainly in qualitative research, it may be more informal than that, but they should definitely specify how. In terms of using a kind of a database of people and paying people to take part, that's actually really, that's how the majority of the research is done. So they normally will work with either they'll have recruited a large number of people, so kind of 200,000-300,000, maybe more people that they'll just have as a kind of community that they'll go to do research, and they'll be paid for each kind of research, each survey or whatever that those people are taking place. Or they might go through a kind of a third party who do that instead. One of the things to make sure is that they're putting quality checks to make sure that the people that are going to take part in your research. So, for example, if they haven't done lots of research on a similar subject recently, you get some people who are kind of professional survey takers, which obviously you don't want.
Exactly.
They keep putting in checks to make sure that these things aren't a problem, and that the quality that the sample you're getting is of good quality. So again, they should spell that out in their proposal as well, of what kind of checks they're putting in place. Yeah,
absolutely, and I think a lot of agencies will do that because it's in their interest to make sure that the quality of what they're doing is high, because it's their business. So, for example, so we spoke earlier about the organisation ESOMAR. So that can help you identify what your kind of local accreditation body is. So, for example, in the UK, most agencies should be accredited by the Market Research Society, and that kind of accreditation should give you confidence that they have good quality research methods and they're not doing anything that is not right or unethical or anything like that. So you can use ESOMAR to find out what that accreditation body is in your own country, and then you can look for agencies that are accredited by that body.
Yeah, okay, no, it's just that I was worried a bit of this kind of, as Darren called them, survey taker, or people who live also by that, and if you have it in the sample, it's, I don't know, there is some casualty issues that I was worried about. But I have another one that this is very quick, and this also maybe more to Darren, because it has to do with the audience research that OGB has conducted with our 8 affiliates recently. what happens if the result of the research, so in the debriefing stage, and also in the insights already provided by the agency, there is an identification of the so-called warm audience. And what happens if, for instance, I see that the research has been conducted not only on demographic basis or regional basis, but also on income basis. I see in the result of the warm audience some specification also about income of this warm audience. But then when I go through the sample, I check out and I see that the people in the sample were not very uniformly distributed in terms of their income. For instance, there is only one person who appears to be unemployed or something like that, and so has no money at all. So if I spot in the results, so probably the answer would be, well, you have some issues with the sampling procedures, but how do you see this?
So I didn't hear the question very well. So is that if
I have some problems with the result, when you do the sampling with the agency proposing a methodology, and it is very clear, you look at it and it seems sound, but then when you see their sample afterwards, and maybe, I mean, they have been uniform on demographics or on gender, but they were not in terms of the income breakdown that were agreed to be put into the methodology. And you see that there have been a lot of middle-class people questioned, but not the other ones. So the income distribution of the sample is not really uniform. So when you have this kind of sample issues that end up in the debriefing, even in the insights provided to you by an agency. I don't know if it was clear.
So, if some kind of demographic criteria is going to be important, what they can do is put quotas on it, so it makes sure. So it's very common for things like age and gender to make absolutely certain that you get an even spread with that. You can't do that with everything because it starts really ramping up the cost of the research, because it becomes quite difficult to get people kind of fitting them quite small kind of niches. I mean, it depends if there's been a gap in that sampling. Obviously it's not ideal, but it does depend on the type of research that they're doing. So if you're going to be targeting on income, then that's obviously a really, really big problem. If you're looking for, say, the kind of gap to choose amongst different income groups, provided that you have sufficient numbers in each of those income groups to be able to find a kind of a valid sample, it's not necessarily critical that you would have a kind of a representative sample on income, because if you're just looking, for example, in what people who earn under 30,000 euros a year or something think about something, then you're just looking at that kind of narrow group. Provided you have, say, 30, 40, 50 people in that group, then you can still make those kind of inferences. So, I mean, it's not a very clear answer to your question, but if it's really, then they should be able to put in kind of quotas to make absolutely certain that they cover those. If it's not, if it's not, then it does kind of depend on the analysis that's being done.
Yeah, I understand you, Darren. It was related clearly to tax justice lines, but tied also with inequality. So this is why I was interested in looking at the sample and seeing that there was not uniformity across the different income ranges. That's just it. But I understand absolutely your way of reasoning. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Anyone else on the line?
No.
Okay, I think it sounds like we've addressed everyone then. So thanks very much for your questions, and I hope that was useful. I'm just going to finish then, just going back to Eva quickly, just to remind you about what the next steps are.
Thank you, and thank you both very much for the presentation. This was really, really useful. I'm conscious of the time, so I'll be very brief. It's just to remind you of the deadlines that were written on the audience analysis call for proposals. So what you should do now, and this call for proposals goes for those Tax Justice Together partners who are not Oxfam, because the Oxfams, they already did jointly their audience analysis, and we are very much using their insights on the process to build this webinar and also the key learnings document. So for the rest of the partners, you know that you have funds available at the central level that you can apply for you to do your audience analysis. And the total amount per partner, it's up to 5,300 euros. And we cannot commit to more for the time being, because that's, if everyone does their audience analysis, that's what each partner should get. So you should let me know by email by December the 1st if you are if you intend to do the audience analysis. Just an email saying yes, this organization is planning to do the audience analysis, and then you can start anytime from now doing your, setting your objectives, writing your brief, and approaching your the different agencies, and then choose the one that you think is best. As Martha was saying, it's not necessarily the cheapest, but you can use different criteria, their experience, obviously the budget, but also the proposal that they submit to you. And when you have chosen the agency, you can send us the full proposal. So basically what you are going to do, when you're going to do it, how much that's going to cost, how are you going to use it, which agency you're going to work with. And we hope to receive all this information before the 30th of January. But you can do the actual research later on. So ideally before April 2016, because we kind of hope that this research can inform your campaign for a decent amount of time within the project lifespan. But you can also align it, as Lison was saying, if you are planning a particular campaign spike at a particular time, you can definitely use that analysis to inform that moment in your campaign. So if you just justify it, we can definitely choose the time that suits your campaign better. And that's it. We look forward to hearing your expressions of interest and to receiving your proposals before the 30th of January. And contact us anytime if you have any further questions.
Lovely, thank you, Eva. Thanks very much, everyone. And then I think we'll send around the recording at some point. Yes, Sophie will send around the recording at some point. But thank you very much for joining, and good luck with your research.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.